30,000 Crusaders surround a city. 100,000 Muslims surround the Crusaders. Two armies locked in concentric circles of death. Both attacking, both defending, both starving.
The year is 1189. The fortress city of Acre sits on the coast of the Holy Land, a strategic prize that controls the maritime supply routes into the Crusader states.
Saladin took it 2 years ago after his devastating victory at Hattin destroyed the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, the Christians want it back.
But here is the madness. Here is what makes this siege unlike any other in medieval history. The Crusaders are both the besiegers and the besieged.
They surround Acre, pounding its walls with catapults, digging tunnels, launching assault after suicidal assault. And at the same time, they are surrounded themselves.
Saladin's army encircles them, cutting off supplies and launching attacks on their camps, trying to break them before they can break the city.
It is a double siege, a ring within a ring. For nearly 2 years, everyone inside both rings will fight, starve, and die in numbers that defy comprehension.
How do you win an impossible war? How do you take a city while being attacked from behind? How do you survive when every day brings less food, more disease, and enemies on every side? This is the Siege of Acre, the most brutal, most bizarre, most devastating siege of the Crusades. Let me take you back 3 years.
Because Acre's agony does not begin on its walls. It begins in a field called Hattin, where the Kingdom of Jerusalem died.
July 4th, 1187. The Battle of Hattin is the greatest disaster in Crusader history. King Guy of Jerusalem led the entire military force of the kingdom, nearly 20,000 men, including almost every knight in the Holy Land, into a waterless desert against Saladin's army.
It was a march of madness. The summer sun of Palestine beat down on men wearing 60 pounds of chainmail. There was no water, there was no shade.
And Saladin, that patient spider, simply waited. He set fire to the dry grass around the Crusader army. Smoke choked them. Thirst maddened them.
They tried to reach the Sea of Galilee. They never made it. Saladin's forces surrounded them on the horns of Hattin, a volcanic hill with no water and no escape.
The slaughter was total. 17,000 Crusaders died or were captured.
The true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom, the very wood upon which Christ was believed to have died, was taken by Muslim hands. The cream of Crusader chivalry was destroyed in a single afternoon.
Men who had devoted their lives to defending the Holy Land died in the dust, their throats cut, their bodies left for the vultures. Guy himself was captured.
When Saladin released him later, after extracting an oath never to take up arms again, he immediately broke the oath. He had no choice. A king without a kingdom is nothing.
A king who surrenders is less than nothing. In the months after Hattin, Saladin swept through the Holy Land like a scythe through wheat.
Jerusalem fell in October. Acre fell soon after. City after city surrendered or was taken by storm. By the end of 1187, the Crusader states that had stood for nearly a century were reduced to a few coastal cities: Tyre, Tripoli, Antioch. Nothing else remained. Nearly 100 years of conquest, of blood, of settlement, erased in 6 months. This is the situation when Guy of Jerusalem arrives at Acre's walls in 1189.
He has barely 400 knights, a few thousand infantry, an absurdly small force to besiege a major fortified city held by Saladin's garrison.
But Guy is desperate. He has broken his oath. He has no kingdom. He has no crown. Conrad of Montferrat, who held Tyre, refuses to recognize him.
He has nothing to lose, and men with nothing to lose sometimes do extraordinary things. The first weeks at Acre are almost comedic.
Guy's tiny army makes camp outside the massive walls. They cannot possibly take the city. They cannot even surround it properly.
Saladin's garrison inside Acre outnumbers them. The garrison commanders must have looked down from the walls in disbelief.
This broken king, with his handful of survivors, thinks he can take Acre?
But then something strange happens. Crusaders start arriving. Word has spread across Europe. The Holy Land has fallen. Jerusalem is in Muslim hands.
The Pope has called for a new crusade. Preachers thunder from pulpits in every language. Kings take the cross.
Nobles sell their lands. Knights mortgage their futures. The Third Crusade is beginning, and its first destination is Acre.
They come by sea from Italy, from France, from the German states, from England, from Denmark, from the Low Countries. Shiploads of warriors, adventurers, the faithful, and the desperate.
Every week, more ships appear on the horizon. Every week, Guy's army grows. By autumn 1189, the Crusader camp holds 30,000 soldiers. They have completely encircled Acre. They have built their own fortifications facing the city walls, trenches, palisades, wooden towers. They have siege engines, catapults, and battering rams. They have supplies coming from the sea. For the first time, taking Acre seems possible, but Saladin has been watching. The Sultan of Egypt in Syria, the unifier of Islam, the man who took Jerusalem, is not going to let Acre fall without a fight. He gathers his forces from across his empire, from Egypt, from Syria, from Iraq, from the distant reaches of his realm they come. By the time he arrives at Acre, his army numbers 100,000 men.
And he surrounds the Crusaders. This is the moment when the siege becomes something unique in military history. The Crusaders are caught in the middle. They face Acre's walls on one side and Saladin's army on the other. They cannot retreat to the sea without abandoning their siege. They cannot advance into the city without exposing their backs to Saladin. They are trapped. But so is everyone else. Saladin cannot simply destroy the Crusader camp. Their fortifications are too strong. They have built walls facing outward as well as inward. Their position, wedged between the city and the sea, gives them interior lines. They can shift forces faster than he can. Every time he attacks, they turn to face him. When he pauses, they turn back to assault Acre. Acre's garrison cannot break out. They try. They launch sorties. They coordinate with Saladin's attacks, hitting the Crusaders from both sides simultaneously.
But the Crusaders have become experts at fighting in two directions at once. They hold their outer wall against Saladin. They assault the inner wall against Acre. They do both at the same time. The siege becomes a war of attrition, and attrition in the Holy Land is measured in corpses. The first winter is hard.
The second is catastrophic. Disease sweeps through the Crusader camp. The chronicles call it Arnaldia, probably a form of epidemic dysentery or typhus, maybe both.
Men who survived the sea voyage, survived the battles, survived Saladin's attacks, die in their tents from fever and bloody flux. Entire units are wiped out. The dead pile up faster than they can be buried. The counts are staggering.
Some sources claim that at certain periods, 200 Crusaders died every day, not from combat, but from disease. The stench of the camp becomes unbearable. Latrines overflow. Bodies decompose in the summer heat. Flies blacken the air. The living walk among the dying, knowing that any day it could be their turn.
Starvation follows disease. The Mediterranean in winter is treacherous. Supply ships cannot reliably reach Acre. When they do arrive, the prices they charge are murderous. The Crusaders eat their horses, animals worth a knight's fortune, reduced to meat.
They eat their leather equipment, belts, scabbards, saddles, boiled until they become something that could almost be called food. They eat things that should not be eaten. A loaf of bread costs a knight's ransom. An egg is worth silver.
A chicken is worth gold. Men who had been wealthy in Europe, men who had sold everything to come on crusade, find themselves begging in the streets of their own camp. And yet they stay. They keep fighting. They keep assaulting the walls of Acre, even as they bury their brothers by the hundreds. Why? The chronicles offer one answer: faith. These men believed, truly believed, that they were fighting for God, that dying in the siege of a holy city would guarantee their salvation. that every Muslim they killed was a step toward paradise. The Pope had promised them absolution. Their priests assured them of heaven. When you believe that death is a doorway to eternal glory, death becomes easier to face. But there is another answer, darker and more human. Many of these men had nowhere else to go. They had sold everything to come on crusade. They had traveled thousands of miles. Their families were counting on them to return with wealth, with land, with glory. Their only hope of fortune, of meaning, of redemption was victory. To retreat was to admit that all of it, the sacrifice, the suffering, the death, had been for nothing. They could not go back. They could only go forward. Even if forward meant dying in a ditch outside Acre's walls, Saladin faced his own problems. His 100,000-man army was not a unified force. It was a coalition of Egyptians, Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds, and volunteers from across the Muslim world.
Many of his emirs wanted to go home. They had families, they had lands. They had not signed up for a 2-year siege. The initial enthusiasm of jihad was fading, replaced by exhaustion and frustration.
The Sultan had to constantly cajole, bribe, and threaten his own commanders to keep them in the field. He rotated units in and out, trying to give his men rest while maintaining pressure.
He sent messengers throughout the Muslim world, calling for more volunteers, more supplies, more faith. But the Crusaders would not break. No matter how many attacks he launched, no matter how many men he lost, they kept fighting. Both sides were bleeding. Neither could win. The stalemate lasted through 1189, through 1190, and into 1191. 2 years of grinding, pointless, devastating war. The plains around Acre became a charnel ground. Mass graves dotted the landscape. The rivers ran foul with waste and blood. And still, neither side would yield. And then the kings arrived. In the spring of 1191, Philip II of France landed at Acre with fresh troops, fresh supplies, and fresh siege equipment. The French brought massive catapults that could finally breach Acre's walls, trebuchets that hurled stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They brought engineers who knew how to dig undermining tunnels. They brought the weight of a European kingdom behind the siege. A few weeks later, Richard I of England arrived. Richard the Lionheart, the most famous warrior king in Christendom. He brought even more men, even more resources, and something equally valuable, leadership. Richard was a warrior born. He had been fighting since childhood. He had conquered territories in France, crushed rebellions, and terrified his enemies with his ferocity. He had no fear, no hesitation, and no mercy for those who opposed him. He was also sick. He had contracted a fever during the voyage that left him weak and bedridden, but he refused to stay in his tent. He had himself carried to the front lines on a litter, directing attacks even as he burned with illness. The soldiers saw their king, pale and sweating, still commanding the assault. If he could fight, so could they. The Crusader camp had been plagued by rivalries and disputes.
Guy of Jerusalem fought with Conrad of Montferrat over who should be king. French nobles feuded with German nobles. Italian merchants competed with each other for profit. Richard and Philip, despite their own rivalry, imposed some semblance of order. The camp had leaders again, real leaders.
The final assault on Acre began in earnest. The catapults pounded the walls day and night. The sound was constant, the creak of ropes, the thud of counterweights, the crack of stone against stone. The tunnels crept forward beneath the foundations, supported by wooden beams that would be burned when the moment came, bringing the walls down. The Crusaders launched wave after wave of attacks, climbing ladders, fighting through breaches, dying by the hundreds but pushing forward anyway. Inside Acre, the garrison was at the breaking point. They had held for almost 2 years. They had watched the Crusader camp grow from 400 men to tens of thousands. They had launched sorties, killed enemies, and repaired walls. But they were exhausted. They were starving. Their own disease and hunger matched the Crusaders. And now the walls were falling. Saladin tried to relieve them. He launched his largest attack of the siege, throwing everything he had at the Crusader fortifications. The fighting was savage. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Muslim cavalry crashed against the outer walls. Crusader infantry held the line with spear and sword. Men died on both sides by the thousands, but the Crusaders held. They had become experts at this. They had been defending their camp for 2 years.
Their fortifications were strong. Their desperation was stronger. On July 12, 1191, the garrison of Acre surrendered. The terms were negotiated. The garrison would be spared. Saladin would pay a ransom of 200,000 gold dinars. The true cross would be returned. 1,500 Christian prisoners would be freed.
It was a reasonable agreement. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides wanted the bloodshed to end. But what followed would stain the Crusades forever.
Saladin delayed the ransom payment. Perhaps he could not gather the money in time. Perhaps he was stalling, trying to negotiate better terms. Perhaps he never intended to pay. The sources disagree.
What they agree on is that the deadline passed and the ransom was not paid. Richard waited and waited. His army needed to march south toward Jerusalem. Every day of delay was a day wasted.
The summer was passing. On August 20th, 1191, Richard ordered the execution of the garrison. 2,700 Muslim prisoners were led out of Acre in chains.
They were brought to a hill called Ayadiyah, within sight of Saladin's army, and there, in front of their would-be rescuers, they were massacred, cut down by sword, by axe, by mace.
Women and children were not spared. The killing took hours. The screams carried across the plain. Saladin could only watch. His army was not in position to intervene.
His men wept. His emirs raged. But there was nothing they could do. The distance was too great. The Crusaders were too ready. The slaughter was complete before any rescue could be attempted.
Richard claimed he had no choice. He could not leave 2,700 potential enemies behind him as he marched south. He could not afford to feed them. His army was already stretched thin.
Saladin had broken the agreement. The prisoners were forfeit. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps it was cold military logic. Perhaps, after 2 years of siege, after watching thousands of his own men die from disease and starvation, Richard simply did not have mercy left in him.
Perhaps he wanted to send a message to Saladin. This is what happens when you break faith with me. We do not have to choose. We only have to record what happened.
Acre fell. The massacre happened. And the Third Crusade continued. Richard would go on to fight Saladin in some of the most famous battles of the medieval era.
Arsuf, where 7,000 Crusaders defeated 20,000 Muslims in a devastating cavalry charge. Jaffa, where Richard personally led a counterattack that saved a city.
Names that still echo in military history. He would come within 12 miles of Jerusalem. He would never take it. The Third Crusade ended in a negotiated truce. The Crusaders kept the coast. The Muslims kept Jerusalem. Pilgrims would be allowed to visit the holy sites. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and solved nothing.
But that is not the story of Acre. The story of Acre is this. 30,000 men surrounded a city, while 100,000 men surrounded them. For 2 years, both sides fought, starved, and died. Disease killed more than swords. The living ate the dead's rations and slept among the corpses.
And in the end, after all that suffering, one side won, one side lost.
And 2,700 prisoners were butchered on a hill. What do we learn from Acre? Perhaps that there are no good guys in wars of this kind.
The Crusaders believed they were fighting for God. So did Saladin's men. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides showed courage that defies explanation. Both sides watched their brothers die and kept fighting anyway. Perhaps human beings can endure almost anything when they believe they have no choice.
The Crusaders at Acre faced conditions that should have broken any army. They did not break. They could not break. There was nothing behind them but the sea, and nothing ahead but the walls they had to take. Perhaps that victory is not always glorious. Acre fell. The Crusaders won. And then they murdered their prisoners in cold blood.
The chronicles recorded it with the same clinical distance they record everything else. It was war. These things happened. They still happen.
2 years, 30,000 besiegers,
100,000 counter-besiegers, uncounted dead from disease, starvation, and battle. Some historians estimate that half of all the Crusaders who came to Acre never left. Not because they stayed, because they died. One city. When the Crusaders finally marched through Acre's gates, they walked past walls scarred by catapult stones, streets littered with rubble, and a population that had eaten its horses, its leather, its hope. They had won. But as they looked back at the camp where they had suffered for 2 years, at the mass graves, at the burned siege engines, at the ground stained brown with blood and worse, some of them must have wondered, was it worth it? Was any of it worth it? The siege of Acre, a ring within a ring, attackers who became defenders, defenders who became attackers.
2 years of impossible war, and at the end, a massacre on a hill, a river of blood that would stain the memory of both sides forever, and a march toward Jerusalem that would never reach its destination.
This is how the Crusades were fought. Not in glory, not in honor, in mud and blood and desperation, by men who had forgotten why they were fighting, but could not remember how to stop.
Acre would remain in Crusader hands for exactly 100 years. In 1291, the Mamluks would take it back, and the last Crusader presence in the Holy Land would end forever.
Everything that was won in 1191, at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, 2 years of suffering, and a massacre that still haunts historical memory, would be lost again. But that is the nature of the Crusades.
Nothing was permanent. Nothing was won forever. Only the dying was real. 30,000 against 100,000. A double siege. A ring within a ring. 2 years of hell on earth. And in the end, a city that changed hands twice more before the story was finished.
Was it worth it? History does not answer that question. History only records what happened. And what happened at Acre was this. Men fought, men died, men won, and men murdered. And then, 100 years later, other men did it all again.